You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is Geoffrey Cain. Geoffrey is an award-winning foreign correspondent, author, commentator, anthropologist, and scholar of East and Central Asia. His first book, Samsung Rising, from a decade of his coverage of the world's largest technology conglomerate, was published in March 2020 and is the topic of our conversation today. A former correspondent at The Economist, Kane is a regular commentator in the Wall Street Journal, Time, and the New Republic, and a frequent guest on CNN, MSNBC, BBC, and Bloomberg. He is a term member of the Council of Foreign Relations. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Geoffrey Cain. Geoffrey, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So your book out, Samsung Rising, it's so well written. It is a phenomenal book. I really enjoyed going through this. And I just thought we'd discuss some of the core elements and some of the things that make Samsung so interesting. One of the most fascinating parts is this intersection between Samsung and Korean culture. Can you just walk us through what does Samsung mean for Korea in a way that might be a little different than how Apple means for the United States or Exxon or any American company?
Yes, so Koreans jokingly call their country, or half jokingly, they call it the Republic of Samsung, and they actually are being somewhat serious when they say that. So Samsung is one group, and when I say group, it's called the Samsung Group, but it's actually not a conglomerate. It's a collection of companies that are tied together through these cross-shareholding structures and various interests, financial stakes that different people have, this ruling family. And it's this massive group that's so nebulous, like you can't even pin down who controls what a lot of the time, and yet it controls or at least accounts for about 1/5 of South Korea's exports. That's one company within the Samsung Group, and that's Samsung Electronics, that accounts for 1/5 of Korean exports. So when Koreans are calling their country the Republic of Samsung, it's something that they use kind of in jest, but it's also a criticism. It's also something that a lot of them don't like, because Samsung is a company that recruits a ton of talented young people. It's one of the biggest recruiters in the country. It's extremely wealthy, extremely powerful. It's ruled by this Lee family. The Lee family is the wealthiest family in Korea. Has enormous sway over the politics of Korea. Korea is a relatively young democracy, about 30 years old, and has this one big company that pretty much calls the shots on a lot of how the country is run. So think about it this way. Imagine if you're an American and you wake up in the morning, and let's say America is the United States of Apple, the United States of Facebook. One company controls the country, and it's like Apple is so big. Apple doesn't just make smartphones, iPhones. It doesn't just make Apple TV. It does a lot more. It builds apartments. It makes microwaves. It makes cars. It makes the semiconductors. It supplies the world with it does shipping. It does all kinds of different businesses. It's vertically integrated, so it controls. It doesn't have to outsource the semiconductor business. It can make everything on its own, and because of that, it's extremely influential within America. So you wake up in the morning, and you're growing up in Chicago or LA or somewhere, Virginia, and you turn on your Apple TV and you watch an Apple-funded TV show. Like Apple owns Netflix; it does all the streaming. You get in your Apple car.
Do you mean it's effectively Amazon?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Amazon. So imagine if I think that Amazon's.
Amazon's already heading in that direction, right?
Amazon's going in that direction, and Amazon's going that way because of all that artificial intelligence they're using, all the just all that the personal devices and the e-readers, and like Amazon controls the content. It also makes the hardware. So you could say that Jeff Bezos is a kind of Samsung-style leader for America too.
Okay.
But he's not quite there yet.
But so I want to kind of differentiate these two, right? Because there is that point, right? Which is, I think it's 25, maybe 30% of the S&P 500 are the FANG stocks: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, right? So we do have a few companies that are consolidating power, consolidating influence. Amazon, right? It's in your home. It's everywhere that you look, everything you do, whether that's Amazon Web Services, Alexa that's in my son's room and in my daughter's room, and right, and we can point to everything where we see Amazon. But there's one really big difference, which is I cannot see a thing where we identify nationally with these companies. So the people that work there might, but there's not a collective identity in the same way that you seem to be arguing with Samsung, that there's an emotional appeal to those companies that I don't think we have here.
Yes, there's an emotional appeal. We don't call the U.S. the United States of Amazon. People don't, run around holding up Amazon flags and cheering on Amazon. They don't go to protests and counter protests where they're saying Amazon is good or Amazon is bad. They're having protests against Amazon with the whole labor issue that's been, the warehouses.
There's no pro Amazon side.
Yeah,
it's just anti folks. Nobody is leaning to Amazon.
Yes, exactly. So think about it this way. Imagine if Amazon were not just a company today. So imagine that back when, in 1789, there's the Constitutional Convention in America, and all the founding fathers are there, and then Jeff Bezos is also there, and he's the Amazon leader, and he says, we're going to make America the United States of Amazon, and Amazon is going to be the company that builds the country. It's the company that we're all going to admire, and it's going to be tied to what it means to be American. So America is not just this fledgling republic that's rebelling from the British. It is in itself an outgrowth of this one company, Amazon. So everything you do is going to be Amazon for the next 200 years, and we're going to have hereditary rule at Amazon. Jeff Bezos, it's like Jeff Bezos the first at the time, and now we're on Jeff Bezos the eighth. In 2020 or whatever it would be. And he's like, and he's like citing constitutional documents saying, America is the United States of Amazon. And if you oppose Amazon, if you oppose our labor conditions in these warehouses, you're just un-American and you just don't get it.
So let's jump to that. So how does dissent work in Samsung? What are some of the issues with dissent, with labor rights, with standing up to the Lee family? How does that play out?
Samsung for a long time did not allow labor unions at all. And that's actually, so I should give some historical background, and this is actually not in the book. I didn't cover a lot of labor, but Samsung was a company that was partially built off very low labor, manufacturing rates out in South Korea. It's a company that really, it could really only grow because it sold stuff cheaper than the Japanese and the Americans, who were the leaders at the time. So why don't the model is, why don't we imitate or copy what Fairchild Semiconductor is doing, what Sony is doing, and just sell it in bigger volumes and just try to flood out the competition. And that's what they did for a long time. So Korea was a dictatorship. It was a dictatorship that supported big business. That was the ideology of the nation itself. And labor was not something. It was like labor was associated with, as in many places, left-wing activism, communism. Like the labor unions are pro-North Korea. That's the image that South Koreans would have. And that's just think about it this way. Like, imagine if Germany were still divided, or if America were divided into two nations and like one more communist. I would imagine that the other half of America would probably look at labor unions and they would say, whoa, these guys might be working with the communist side of America, so we have to be careful not to let them overthrow our government, infiltrate us. So the South Koreans had this approach for a long time that labor was the enemy. And when in the 1980s, so South Korea was starting to democratize, starting to grow into a major economic power around the world, supplying the big companies, Apple, the Macintosh. They were supplying Sony. They were becoming one of the rubber stamp players in the world of technology. And so labor unions said, well, we want a piece of this pie too. We're building this nation together. So we want you, and this was in the 1980s when wages are extremely low, we want you to double the wage within, it was something like a month or two. And, of course, Samsung and the government said, we can't double the wage. So yes, you are getting paid not that much. Your wages are terrible. Your working conditions are terrible. But we cannot double it because that's just going to destroy the business model. And so they had this policy for a long time of no unions, because unions are going to raise wages too high, and that's going to destroy the Samsung model of cheap manufacturing. Now, the interesting thing that happens,
it was cheap and inferior, right? I mean, when South Korea was first, they were making T-shirts and they were making cheap electronics. Am I right with that? That they started, like, we think of them today, we think of South Korea today as advanced manufacturing, very high quality, and that was not the image for a very long time.
No, it was inferior back then. It was inferior on the level, or maybe even worse, of what China had for a long time. China is a country that's only now emerging. It still has quality issues. And I think that most people our age can remember that day, the day of Made in China. You go to the local Toys R Us and pick up a plastic toy and it says Made in China, and then it breaks in 2 days. And I remember that well when I was a kid. It was just like, it was like China was seared in my mind as just a country that I just did not want to buy products from. And now the smartphones are actually quite good in my experience. I've owned Huawei phones before, over here in Asia and the Middle East, and they actually do function well. But think back to Korea. We're talking about 1960s to 80s. Also, Japan was another country like this. Before it emerged as a major quality player, it was almost always in Asia, some kind of cheap manufacturer with a model that was built on high volume, low price, supply, like OEM model. So it's an original equipment manufacturer, supply stuff for cheap, send it to GE, give them the microwave, and they'll put the GE logo on it. Now, that only worked because Korea and other Asian nations were built on an export model. They were protectionist countries. They did not allow America or Japan or others to sell products, to sell cars there or microwaves. And so they said, we're going to export our microwaves and we're going to export them at high volume. But then the problem is the Cold War ends, and this is 1989. This is early 1990s. The world is starting to open up. This is the age of NAFTA. It's the age of, the World Trade Organization. The Doha round had ended in the 80s. And there was this new era emerging. And I think that we're currently living in the end of this era of the globe tethering together through networks, and it could be trade, it can be infrastructure, roads. Look at what China is doing now with the One Belt, One Road. There's this tethered network of nations and peoples starting to work together in ways that had actually not been seen in human history, I would say, since the Silk Roads of medieval times. And I don't know if your readers are interested in economic history at all, but really that age of when companies like Samsung and Sony and Huawei were starting to emerge on the global stage, that's really it's almost unprecedented in human history, the circumstances that they had managed to take hold of and to benefit from. And so, Samsung has this chairman. He's the second generation leader of this family dynasty. His name was Lee Kun-hee. And he was this recluse who, he likes to sit in his bedroom all day, and he watches lots of movies and documentaries. He reads a ton. He's kind of this awkward intellectual who enjoys studying civilizations and history and the things I just talked about, the Silk Roads and how the world works when it's tied together through trade and through networks. And he concluded from that, well, if this is true, if the world is headed this way at the end of the Cold War, then Samsung's going to be destroyed. I mean, we might have 5-10 years left before Samsung is completely done with. And so he attempted to instigate a reform at Samsung. He said, we cannot be the third-rate manufacturer forever. We can't keep making these cheap microwaves and TVs that break and that no one wants to use. And so he called all of his executives to Frankfurt, Germany, for 8 hours of speeches a day. He went on for 3 days, very few breaks. The executives could not even get up to go to the bathroom. They had to wash their clothes in the hotel and hang them up to dry outside on the balcony. The hotel managers complained. And, they were just trying to show their loyalty to the Samsung empire. And so Cain gives these speeches, and he says, you have to change everything. You have to change everything except your wife and children. That was the literal phrase that he used that went down in company lore.
And did he give specifics? Because in organizations, it's really hard to do a 180 shift from a low-cost, cheap producer that's doing things in mass to advanced manufacturing. It's very difficult. For most organizations, you focus on a single area of shift or a new product line that's within what you're already doing, but you usually would stick to, so for example, right? So if Tesla, when Tesla came out with this new truck, it's naturally electric, right? There's all these things that are kind of already in their wheelhouse. It's not going to be a cheap electric truck. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be, it's going to be highly digital. It's going to have the driverless features, right? All these things that make it where when you make a shift, so Elon Musk could sit with them and say, okay, we're going to make a shift, but it would be very difficult for them to make the kind of shift that Samsung does. So can you comment just on how does Lee, because it must have been baffling to the executives to have sat through those meetings and to have somebody come in and say, look, we are going to operate in an entirely different company that it's been going the same way for decades, and now we're going to completely shift.
Yes, and that was the problem, that all the incentives they had to rise through the ranks of Samsung were based on volume. Sell this X number of semiconductors in the first half of 1987 and you're set, and that's it. So sales volume, that was what Samsung was attuned to. And yeah, you're right. So that's it's not something that happens easily, especially in a big ship like Samsung. It's a massive company. But you have to remember that He had excellent circumstances. So Samsung was one of the only employers that had a name in Korea. So everyone wanted to work for Samsung. He had a lot of, he had the market on his side. It was Samsung's labor market, and so they could choose who they wanted to work with. So his strategy was name and shame and expose all the sinners of this company.
Okay.
He went around the company for a long time, and he said, you have to change this. You have to, change that factory line process. And nobody was listening to him. They saw him as this lazy rich kid who, was a bit of a playboy and liked to drive his Porsche around on a company racetrack. He had a prescription drug habit that, I've documented in the book. I mean, he was not well liked at the beginning, like many heirs of big companies. So, I think that this is the kind of thing that could only happen in a place like Korea, and it's that so he actually sent in, so Samsung had this, it's called the Samsung Broadcasting Center, and it was an in-house journalistic, investigative broadcast that they would do every so often. And he brought in his Samsung journalists, and he said, I want you to take hidden cameras, go into my plants, go into the microwave plant, the washing machine plant, go into all these, and I want you to put the cameras on the assembly line and film what people are doing. And then I am going to look at it, and I'm going to broadcast it, and I'm going to expose everyone who's messing up. So he watched the video later. He was in his hotel room, and he was shocked at what he saw, because it would be like they'd be making washing machines, and it would be coming at the end of it's like coming off the end of the assembly line, and then there's a quality assurance person, trying to close the door, and the door doesn't even shut because the plastic mold is done so badly. So it scratches against, the mold of the washing machine. And so, all these factory workers are looking at it, and they're like, what should we do? And so they, instead of restructuring the process to be more efficient and to be better with waste and to be better with quality assurance, they just take this little knife and shave off the excess plastic of each washing machine, and then they send it off, and it's sold in America and sold in Japan and all these big markets. And that's the reason why at the time, if you went to any, back in the day, there was Radio Shack or whatever, Sears. It's like you go, you look at the washing machines, and there's, the American and the Japanese one up front, the German one, there's Bosch or whatever, and then you look down, you look in the back corner, and then there's Samsung, and nobody wants to buy it, and it's discounted at a half rate because it's like the third return they've had on, on half of their products. I mean, it literally was that bad. I'm not even exaggerating. I was looking at one number that showed that 1 out of every 7 Samsung handsets during this period was declared by Samsung to be faulty. And Chairman Lee even sent it out to all of his colleagues as a New Year's gift in 1995. And a lot of them found that actually these phones didn't work at all. They were terrible and they broke after a few minutes. So they sent back the gift, which in Korean culture is a major insult to send someone's product back to them. It's like, I mean, even in America, that's kind of insulting. But just think Korea is hierarchies and Korea is highly formal. And he was just incensed that his factory managers would allow phones like this to go out as gifts from the chairman himself to his best friends. It's like, you should at least, make sure those phones are better working. But even those were terrible quality. So
it reminds me of GM in the 80s. All the right, same thing, just cars being produced in mass. Whatever it is, just get it out the door. Whatever faults, we'll deal with it later, or just sell it as is.
Yeah, it's GM or it's Ford. It's one of these, there was the big auto crisis of the 80s, and there's the Toyota way. The Japanese are coming in and crushing the American competition. I mean, that was a time of panic, and it actually, I think it has a lot, some in common, at least, with what we're experiencing today. Maybe not quite the same. I think we have new geopolitical elements, but it really is, like what was happening with that American reckoning against Japan in the 1980s, that the Japanese are going to take us over and do better and make better cars, better CD players, better VCRs. Yeah. And this is what happened with Korea. They had this similar reckoning that our quality is terrible, and the only reason that we're successful is because we're protected by the government, state protectionism. We can export our way out of poverty. And we can't do that now because in the 1990s, that's globalization. And now we're on the same playing field as Sony, as IBM, as GE, as Apple. And Chairman Lee, he was smart because a lot of business leaders weren't able to do this. A lot of people knew that this was coming, but he had the bravery and the boldness. I mean, he risked his career. If this had failed, he would have gone down in the storybooks as, the heir, the reckless heir who destroyed his father's company. But he managed to do it through this strategy of shaming, naming, of making people look bad. And so, that's not
usually the way that we turn around companies. Like that would not be the traditional kind of business school type method for turnaround.
No. No. And I actually have a story to tell from a Samsung executive who I interviewed who he was there during that period. And this was not in the book. I just couldn't fit it. So he was an American executive who came over from, I think, Lucent, from one of those big telecoms companies. One of the first Americans to work at Samsung. His name was Pete Skarzinski. And he told me about how, this was back in the days of Jack Welch and, the lean organization. So, you have to create this learning organization. You have to remove 20% of your workforce each year and then hire the next 20% to come in to make it an organization that's constantly changing and updated for the times. I think that's MBA, that's like biblical MBA material right there.
Well, it's the most ruthless. People are not really teaching Jack Welch anymore. So
yeah, it's ruthless.
He's kind of overstayed his ideas are outdated at this point.
Yeah,
companies that do it, but that's not a mainstream idea anymore.
Yeah. So that's certainly gone out, and I have my own opinion of Jack Welch is that I think that he turned his company into a finance company principally, and I think that's the mainstream view now, right? So, but anyway, we're talking. So this is the 1990s, and this is the height, the 80s, the 90s of the Jack Welch wisdom, and so there are these Korean Samsung executives. They're reading the Harvard Business Review, and there's the latest story about how to create the learning organization, the ruthless organization. They interpreted it differently. So they would call Pete Skarzinski, this vice president, and they said, all right, so we're going to become a learning organization, and Chairman Lee demands this. So every single year, you have to fire 20% of your workforce. So, he's sitting there, and he's just looking at these Harvard Business Review articles, and he's trying to explain to them, well, you have to hire, 20%. You got to hire the next round of people to come in. And they said, no, you have to fire 20% each year, and you have to make the company grow.
That's really
Yeah. So that's just to give you an idea of the mindset of Samsung and a lot of Korean companies, that it's ruthless, it's top down, it's hierarchy. If you can't make it, if you cannot pull your own weight and play a political game too, then you're out, and that's that. You're done. And we're not going to hire new people. We're trying to cut costs. Like the goal is cutting costs while raising volume or raising quality. They're always looking for a cost to cut. And that also explains a lot of the product disasters they've had over the years. There was the Galaxy Note 7.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute.
We'll get to that later. Yeah.
So I know it's kind of an odd question, but is Samsung closer to the culture of North Korea or closer to the culture of Apple, Facebook, another substitute technology company?
So this is actually in the book, and I think that Samsung and South Korean business culture actually does have a shared heritage with North Korea. And that's a shared heritage that's not just uniquely Korean, but it comes from Japan and historically from the Japanese Empire that led up to World War II. There was a unique culture that Japan had built with the goal of mass mobilizing its entire population to build the nation, to fight the war, to move forward to the future. And it's a very similar culture to what Korea has today. And there's a whole history I could get into. I don't know if your listeners want to hear the whole history, but it basically comes from the fact that Korea was a Japanese colony, but it wasn't just any colony. It wasn't like the British in India or the French in Indochina. I mean, these European nations tended to hire a local administrative elite, and they would manage things on their own. So like there was a local population that was handling things. Whereas when you look at Japan and Korea, it was an attempt to remake and to build the entire nation in Japan's image. It was completely different from the European style of colonialism. So that's why pretty much every single Korean business owner embraced the Japanese model, because that's what they knew, and they studied in Japan. They were all graduates of major Japanese universities. And even the word chaebol, which means wealth clan or wealth group financial clan in Korean, it's the same as zaibatsu, which is the Japanese equivalent, which means wealth clan. And also they have the same Chinese character. So you can see that these are the same groups. But so to answer your question, yes. So actually, Asian companies, like not all of the things that I'm talking about are East Asian. They're not all Korean. They're not all Japanese. There are similarities with the Silicon Valley firms. So I was always entertained. I used to cover Apple and the Silicon Valley firms before I was in Asia, and I was just always amused by the Steve Jobs cult. I thought that was a bit ridiculous and overplayed, and I kind of made fun of the hardcore Apple fans and how they worship Steve Jobs as this Gandhi figure. Like, come on, Steve Jobs is Gandhi. Like he's gonna liberate a nation from the British at the height, like after World War II is over. I mean, that's a completely different class of person. He was a visionary.
You don't think the MacBook Pro has done that for us?
I don't think that the MacBook Pro or the iPhone or the iPod, I don't think it's quite liberated South Africa from apartheid. I don't think it's Martin Luther King level genius. It's not Einstein, but it is important. It has changed a lot of the ways that we do things. So there's Mark Zuckerberg. He has his own cults. Sheryl Sandberg, Jeff Bezos. All these influential figures. They have these kind of funny, strange cults at their companies. There's Travis Kalanick at Uber before he was taken down by the sexual harassment allegations. And I've always gotten a kick out of that. Going to Silicon Valley, it's like you meet these young Stanford graduates, and they're finishing their PhD in artificial intelligence programming, and they're super brilliant. And I've always met a lot of these people, and they just can't stop talking about how great like Travis Kalanick is. And it's like, I mean, come on, this guy's a serial, like, what is he? He's not quite a sexual harasser, but he's been involved in some pretty, it seems like, shady things that forced him to step down. And
I think one of the big contrasts is that for U.S. Silicon Valley companies, the doctrine is against the grain, countercultural thinking, counterintuitive thinking. Have you read the Steve Jobs biography?
Yeah, by Walter Isaacson.
The Isaacson one, which I think it's a brilliant book. But one of the things you get out of Jobs is that Jobs is a leader who is authoritarian in nature, but expects his employees to stand up against him and actually encourages them to defy what he says.
Yes.
And there is an element of that defiance that I think captures a lot of US tech firms. And also,
Yes.
if you take something like Uber, where Travis is an asshole. So I think there's no other right. He's really a horrible person. But the way that Uber broke things and then asked questions later, violated city ordinances and state ordinances and countries' laws in order to expand, is very much in the defiance kind of mentality, I think, of U.S. corporate culture. And in a way, it is allowed in many places for you to completely question the authority of executives. And that's in stark contrast with the North Korean model, right? Where North Korea is the utmost extreme example of where, the only books that are allowed in North Korea are the writings of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. I think there's the only few books that are allowed. So it's kind of setting that up. Where does Samsung lie?
Yes. So I should clarify. Yes, I like to make fun of the Silicon Valley cults that exist in some of these companies, but it's easy to make comparisons and to contrast, this or that culture or company. The important thing is that you have to go back to the historical genesis of where that came from. And yes, Silicon Valley, that is the difference. Silicon Valley, I think it was born out of a fusion of the hippie counterculture of the 60s and 70s, and that's Steve Jobs, with the technology, the advances from the military-industrial complex at, Fairchild Semiconductor, supplying the semiconductors that was used in the moon landings. I mean, that was a period, that was the top-down period that looks more like what Korea has today, even though it's not quite the same. And it was that fusion of, like a lot of these hippie and left-wing protester types in that era. They were extremely distrustful of technology. They thought that technology could be used to control people. And as we're learning today, it is being used to predict people's behavior and then to nudge it in certain directions. I mean, that's like one of the big things that's been happening over the past few years with this big data. But there was this class of hippie, people like Steve Jobs, who realized that they could actually repurpose that technology to aid with the rebellion or aid the resistance, to go against the grain and to change things, shake up IBM, like release the Macintosh, see if you can, do something at a more premium level than IBM and mess with them, mess with their business model and show them that, even though you're just, two guys in a garage, the world's changing and it's our time now. It's no longer the days of the military industrial, thing that was going on during the Cold War. That was his idea, I think. And if you were to go over to Korea and Japan too, it's a different story. The origins really do come from Japan in World War II, Japan as this empire that's expanding, and Japan needs big industrial conglomerates that can sustain the nation, that can vertically integrate things, that can bring down costs, it can hire even slave labor in the case of Japan. I mean, a lot of these Japanese companies were built on prisoner of war labor that was free during the war era. And then after that, Korea never really had a movement that was quite like Silicon Valley. It simply went to top-down control. It was the dictator of Korea, Park Chung-hee, said in the 1960s, well, we need big companies, industrial conglomerates that can build the nation and bring down costs and export our way out of poverty, just like Japan did. Mm-hmm. There's really not much of a difference between them. And so he enlisted the chaebol groups, which are Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and SK. LG at the time was it was two companies, Lucky and Gold Star. And these were the giant groups that built Korea into what it is. They went around the world, they adopted technologies, they imitated them, and they played a game of catch-up as opposed to what Apple did, which was a game of starting at the premium and attacking from the very top. Like making things that people don't need. And Steve Jobs he had that famous saying that people don't really know what they want until you show it to them. I mean, that was the Apple approach, whereas Samsung was all about, we're going to do fireburst increments over time with the help of the government. We're going to make the semiconductor just a little bit better each year, and we're going to make the display a little bit better, higher resolution each year, until we're eventually at the level of Sony or Apple. And then we can stand on the same ground with them, and then we can try to overtake them. That was really, the model, but it's also a model that was quite difficult to execute because of the reasons we talked about before, that you can't go from a cheap manufacturer to a high-quality designer UX company that easily. You can't just become an Apple by starting on the factory floor. It's a different culture and a different process.
Let's turn to the fiasco that probably most people are familiar with. There were the stories of people on planes that had Samsung phones that were blowing up. So just recall what happened with the phone incident, and how did Samsung deal with this true crisis?
Yes. I was actually in Seoul when this started unfolding. I remember it vividly. I was in my apartment. It was August 2016 when the first reports started going out, and I was on YouTube. I was also in the Korean webosphere, blogosphere, looking at these reports, and people were saying, well, I just got this phone and it caught fire. And at first, I was thinking like, well, is it possible that there's always a percentage of, phones, lithium ion batteries that just ignite? I mean, is it just the way technology works these days? And then more and more started pouring in. I was following this closely because I was writing a book at the time, and I started thinking, well, wait, there's actually something going on here. And it's really strange that Samsung has not said a single thing in about 5 or 6 days since these reports started coming out. I actually, I called a contact. I have a PR contact at Samsung, and he just said, I haven't seen those reports, but it was very terse. It was like they didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to deal with it. It was just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. It must be the fault of the user. Maybe they punctured the battery and messed it up somehow and blew it up. But it was dismissive. And then over time, it was about week 1 or week 2, I started getting emails and Facebook and LinkedIn messages and text messages from people who I had known at Samsung over the years, and they were saying, "Hey, Jeff, we have a serious problem, and you really need to look into this." They knew that I was writing a book. I had talked with them about it, and they said, this is going to get big, and get ready because this is currently being silenced and censored within Samsung. So I went back to my PR contacts, and I said, hey, so I have heard from a few employees, can't say their names, I don't want to get them in trouble, but it sounds like there is a problem. At least internally, people think that there's something happening there. And the only response I got was, well, we can't verify any reports. We can't comment on that. We can't verify outside reports of, what's happening at Samsung. Like basically what he said between the lines is that if it doesn't come in an official report from Samsung, then it's not real. Until we confirm it, it doesn't exist. And I'm just thinking, this is how Samsung is. And I'm just thinking, okay, so I started, following, more phones started exploding. Then suddenly one day Samsung makes an announcement and they said, okay, so we're going to recall the phone now. Galaxy Note 7, you can get your replacement phone. This is after, there were all kinds of incidents. Like one was in a Jeep and it exploded and burned the car down. Luckily, he wasn't in the car. I mean, this guy woke up in the middle of the night in Kentucky and there was smoke all over his room, and he was checked into the doctor and was found to have severe smoke inhalation. I mean, it was clearly a public danger. So Samsung announced the recall, and then nothing happened. And I was sitting there wondering, so is there a recall or not? And I started calling contacts back in the States where the recall was supposed to happen, and they said, well, Samsung announced a recall, but they never actually went through the process of dealing with the federal government, the CPSC, which is the Consumer Product Safety Commission. When they recall things, they're supposed to go through a legal system to recall a product with the assistance of the federal government. And I called back Samsung, and they were like, I have no idea about that. Like the PR guy literally said, I have no idea about what Samsung is supposed to do to work with a government, in another country to recall a product. And I'm thinking, like, what the heck is going on here? So this went on and on and on. And then, since I was writing this book, I started getting calls from CNN and Bloomberg TV and NPR, and I was, I was like kind of the Samsung guy at the time, and I would give my comments and telling, the news what's happening. So I've spoken with employees, and they say that there's a big problem and that the company is censoring it because of these hierarchies. They're saying that it's a top-down organization that discourages its employees from speaking up, that they knew that this was happening, and they say that there were hints that this was going to happen. They suspected something was wrong before they released the phone, but they were afraid of speaking up because their bosses didn't want to look bad, so they released it. And I was saying all these things on the news, and then I started getting attacked. So rather than deal with the issue, Samsung's public relations executives started contacting news outlets, and they said, this guy, Geoffrey Cain, he is one-sided, he's sensational, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Don't listen to him. He's not somebody you want to be talking to. And these are big American news media outlets, and they actually contacted me and they said, what's going on here? I've never seen, they said, we've never actually seen a major multinational company, contact us directly and try to discredit a commentator or a TV writer who's just making these comments. And it was just bizarre.
It sounds so peculiar to me. Why would they do that? They're smart. So these are smart executives. What's going on that would lead them to do that?
It's national pride. Samsung is tied to the well-being of South Korea. And if Samsung loses face in the public image, then Korea's lost face. And on top of that, there's another factor to it too. It's that within Samsung, these hierarchies, these extremely militaristic hierarchies, suffocate the rank and file. If you are a top executive, you have a lot of power, and everybody below you is basically under your boot. And they have to praise you. They have to do what you say. They can't ask questions. Even if they just want to clarify something with you, they can't really ask a question for fear of offending the boss. And then if you look at the Samsung organization too, the way it's structured is that people are reshuffled on a yearly or every 2 years a basis of that time frame. So, if you're in your job and it's okay, well, my annual review is coming up, and remember, this is September and the annual review is in December, and the phones are exploding, the instinct of everybody is going to be, all right, don't say anything, suffocate it, there's no problem here. I don't want to get some kind of bad review and then get shuffled to a crappy job, which is, somewhere in the heavy industries field, which doesn't have a lot of prestige in Samsung. I mean, you're going to be sitting in some basement office answering mail if you can't do this right. So it's a combination of the pride that they have, but also the structure that they've built that's built on fear and shame. The idea that you can run a company by shaming people, which is what we talked about before with the chairman. So as I was observing this and interviewing people who were involved, I started realizing the irony of the situation, that the same forces, the same philosophy, the same idea of perpetual crisis, as the chairman used to call it, that made Samsung successful, was also the force and the idea and the philosophy that brought down the Galaxy Note 7 and nearly brought down Samsung Electronics with it. I mean, Samsung Electronics was in big, big trouble, and they weren't willing to admit it. And if they were in big trouble, if their stock fell by 70%, I looked at one model that I put in the book, and 70%, it might sound like a lot, but that's what happened to Nokia. We have to remember that this does happen to big companies. If Samsung fell that far, then the South Korean economy would essentially enter a recession from one line of smartphones failing. It would just be a domino effect, one after another.
A 70% decline in a stock is a very big deal. I mean,
it's a very big deal.
It does happen. That's not a normal decline.
No, it's not a normal decline.
Normal declines at 30%, maybe 50. 70 is, there's something, if a stock goes down by 70%, unless they're in some cataclysmic macro environment, there's something very seriously up 70, 80%.
Yes, but that's the problem with Samsung, is that it's created a system it's a systemic risk, because all these different affiliates are wound together in cross shareholdings, and that's why a 70% scenario might be plausible. It's a worst case scenario, but that's because if let's say there's a bad quarter and Samsung Semiconductors collapses because of a mixture of trade wars with Japan and China, and Samsung can't supply the right chemicals to another Samsung company to make the right semiconductor that's in demand this year, then that would cripple the smartphone business. And then since they can't sell smartphones, that would cripple the display business. And then that would cripple the Samsung Corning glass partnership. They're not selling any glass for their own smartphones. That would then cripple the Samsung, the advertising company Chael, because it's like, they have nothing to, the advertising is a disaster that quarter. It's the kind of thing. And then on top of that, there's the Samsung financial affiliates that have major holdings in each company. This whole thing is a domino that could come down really easily. And that's why, once that happens, that's when Samsung Electronics could fall pretty far.
So how do they make it out of this mess?
So it was a long road. It wasn't easy. So they had one big problem. So the biggest problem was that their brand was destroyed for the time being. That every time, because they had A, taken so long to respond, and B, released a faulty product in the first place, and then C, they recalled the product, and then they recalled the replacement products after that because the replacement products were disasters too. They were in a lot of trouble because now it was just the Samsung brand. People were going on social media. They were going on TV joking like, my washing machine's going to explode. My Samsung monitor is going to explode. The risk that you're in with Samsung is that if one product fails spectacularly, then remember that the Samsung name is on every single product out there. Samsung makes everything. And so now the entire company is just at risk of imploding because it's so built on that brand. So they did a few things. I don't think they actually solved the problem, but the first thing they did is that they did these laboratory tests and they released the results, and they actually did confirm what the core cause was, and they gave a big press conference, and they said that it's a problem with the two nodes of the battery, that the way the battery is structured, that the positive and negative sides were touching, and that would cause the phone to combust. So that was a result of, I think, the factory processes, that they were in a big hurry, and the executives said, give us more battery life, make a better battery, a bigger battery, it's got to be longer, it has to be great, it has to be perfect. But they didn't give their workers enough time and space and questioning ability to discuss it and to figure out what's possible. They just said, make the great battery, and it blew up. So this is the thing that they did not solve. They never looked at the management processes that led to this in the first place. What they did look at was the actual factory quality safety control process. So they said, we're going to release this, they called it the 8-step process of double-checking the battery, double-checking the product before it goes off the assembly line and into the consumer's hands. But I think that a lot of journalists who are watching, and business professors like yourself who I spoke with, they were looking at that response, that answer, and they thought, well, wait a second, doesn't every major smartphone company that relies on these combustible lithium-ion batteries, don't they already do some kind of quality check just like this? Why is Samsung coming out right now and saying, oh, we're going to do an 8-step check? So it just raised more question marks, because it means, like, are you basically admitting that you weren't doing quality control or weak quality control?
Was it a quality? So getting into the management questions, have they reformed the culture that gave rise to these issues?
No, and that is the Achilles heel. That is something that internally just dozens, maybe even hundreds of Samsung executives over the years have told me that we have a culture problem. And this is something that a lot of businesses can learn from the Samsung experience. How do you take a hierarchical, militaristic corporate culture that prizes loyalty and speed and execution, as opposed to vision and thought and imagination and inventiveness? How do you take that kind of mid-20th century culture and update it for the world that we live in, which prizes the latter factors that we talked about? So, I mean, just to give another example, it's not just the exploding batteries, but Samsung for a long time has wanted to become a software maker, and they've wanted to control their own operating system and build an ecosystem of hardware devices that can all communicate with each other on this Internet of Things. I mean, think about how powerful Samsung would be making everything that's imaginable under the sun, and it's all connected on this one giant system. It would be like Amazon times 1,000 right there. I mean, they would have it set, but they just cannot do it. They've tried over and over throughout the years, but the top-down hierarchical culture of execution as opposed to vision and imagination, built from the factory floor and not from the creative design offices, is the culture that kills the software, kills the UX, kills the content, kills the things that are kind of more 21st century, more creative, more softer, require more teamwork and careful thought. So I think that's why, looking at Samsung and studying the way they've responded to problems over the years, I think that they're ultimately going to be placed more in the realm of China, of Huawei, as opposed to Apple and Silicon Valley. I don't think that they're ever going to escape that trap of focusing on hardware manufacturing. And that's their weakness, because we're entering this age, I think the 2020s, it's going to be a time of big disruptions like what we saw in the past decade.
Yeah, we're in the era where software eats the world, to quote Andreessen Horowitz.
Oh, yes. And not only that, but I mean, imagine if artificial intelligence does come to fruition at the level of the promises that, we're being promised by these big companies. Imagine if, AI can read your radiology x-rays and order your food and do all this. I mean, that world might be approaching very soon. And, meanwhile, Samsung's making hardware. They're trapped in this hardware cycle where they've got to invest tons of R&D and release, the next semiconductor, the next display. They're always on the clock just to release that next thing, or else they're going to fail. Like, imagine if they had that perfectly scalable software solution across everything. They would just be so, it would probably be the most powerful and maybe the wealthiest company in the world if they had mastered that.
All right, I have just one more question. How has Samsung responded to you writing this book? I mean, you're probably not their favorite person.
No, I'm not. I'm definitely.
Have you ever talked to the Lee family, or how have they responded?
I did speak to the Lee family. So I interviewed one member of the Lee family whose name was Henry. He's actually I'm trying to remember right now. So he would be the cousin of Jay Lee, who's the current he's the heir to Samsung. He's going to become the chairman soon, and he's the nephew of Chairman Lee, who's currently in a hospital suite. So I should just clarify for listeners that Chairman Lee, he's the chairman. They call him the chairman, but he's actually been incapacitated and almost unconscious for the past 6 years in a hospital suite for inheritance reasons. It's really silly. I mean, this is another difference. We're talking Silicon Valley versus Korea. Could you imagine if, Mark Zuckerberg's on life support for 6 years and he's still the CEO of Facebook? It's totally hilarious. I get a kick out of it. I never stop laughing about that. So, so I talked to one Lee family member. He was the only one who would grant me an interview. The other ones, I did ask for interviews from a lot of them. I spoke to a few of them off the record. They were a bit terrified of publishing a book because they told me that they are terrified of the central Lee family, which is the part of the Lee family that controls Samsung Electronics, that, they're going to oust me from the family if I talk. They're going to cause trouble for me. My business is going to suffer. We're going to lose business from Samsung. Everybody in Korea who's in power is scared of Samsung. That's the lesson I learned. Nobody is immune from the wrath of Samsung if you speak out against them. But I managed to convince this one man who is the honorary chairman of Hansol, which is a Samsung spinoff that makes chemicals, to talk to me. And he sat down. He gave me the inside story from the beginning to the very recent history until the 1990s, 2000s. And he told me about the key figures, the chairman. He used to live with the chairman, told me about his personality, revealed his prescription drug dependence that he had, his car crashes that he was in, his generally, lavicious lifestyle of drugs and hookers and all this kind of thing. That's how the chairman was living. So I published this, and Samsung actually did not respond to the book formally. They responded through back channels. I did hear from some Samsung executives. They said that, look, our PR guys, the top guys, they're not happy about your book. They're kind of angry. They're pissed off. They're not going to respond publicly, because if they respond publicly, it's going to shine a light and sell more books. So they don't want to do that. The response that we did get, though, was from this Lee family member who I interviewed. I recorded it. I had the transcript. It was an interview on the record, and then I published it. And he responded and he said, "I'm going to sue you for publishing this."
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, so we got a lawsuit threat. Nothing came of it. My publisher, Penguin Random House, they have a formidable, very smart legal team, and they just wrote back and they said, "We're not changing the book for you. We're not going to erase any sections, so take a hike." And haven't heard from them since. But before we sign off, I should just explain that in Korean culture, it is a different culture. It is based on face saving. Even if you do give an interview to the press and you agree to be published, if there's blowback later, it's the kind of place where people do sue people for libel. The libel laws there are not that strong. And if your honor is damaged in the public eye, then within Korea, you might have the grounds for some kind of lawsuit. Not so much in America, where we have the First Amendment, which, as you said, not worried about that. I'm not worried about it either. And I'm grateful to be American for that reason, because we can write books like Samsung Rising. We can write books about big companies, about Apple and Facebook and Uber, and we don't have to worry about, for the most part, we don't have to worry about getting sued for libel in a court in some big billion-dollar case.
I mean, not just big companies. I mean, John Bolton has a book out, Omarosa. There's plenty of books even by the president, and you can pretty much do what you want. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and that's what's incredible about the American publishing world that I love. That if you have evidence to back it, if you witnessed something, if you recorded it, if you heard it, you can credibly publish it, and you'll be okay. You don't have to censor yourself to cater to power, which is not like Korea.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, nice to talk to you, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.